My name is Daisy. I'm in my late 30s now, but at the time this story begins, I was in my early 30s, old enough to know myself, young enough for people to still believe they knew me better. I live a quiet life. I work with documents, with details most people skim past. I'm the kind of woman people describe as steady, low maintenance, or when they think they're being kind, not complicated. If you passed me on the street back then, you wouldn't have noticed me. I dressed simply. I spoke carefully. I listened more than I talked. In my family, that made me the reasonable one, the background one, the one who would be fine no matter what was decided without her. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic way. It's about something quieter and, I think, more honest. It's about what happens when people mistake your silence for incapacity, your calm for consent, and your patience for weakness. I'm telling this now because time has given me distance. Enough distance to see the full shape of what happened. Enough distance to speak without anger. And enough distance to understand that what hurt the most wasn't what my family did, but how easily they convinced themselves they were doing it for my own good. The moment everything changed can be summarized in one sentence. I never imagined would apply to my life. My family declared me mentally unfit to take my property. I didn't hear it in a meeting. I wasn't warned ahead of time. I found out when a court-appointed evaluator showed up at my door unannounced. This story is about how something that extreme doesn't begin with a single betrayal. It begins with small assumptions, with roles quietly assigned, with decisions made just this once, until one day you realize you were never in the room at all. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through who I was to them, how the lines blurred, and how silence, mine and theirs, slowly reshaped everything. There are no heroes here, no villains either, just people, fear, and a system that rewards whoever speaks first and loudest. I'm not sharing this to settle scores. I'm sharing it because stories like this rarely sound like warnings when you're inside them. They sound like normal family conversations, like concern, like love even. So before we go further, I want to ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever been so trusted to handle things quietly that no one noticed when your voice disappeared? To my family, I was the reliable one. Not the leader, not the dreamer, not the difficult one. Reliable sat somewhere lower on the hierarchy. Useful, steady, expected. I was the daughter who would answer emails clearly, read the fine print, and remember birthdays without reminders. The one who didn't raise her voice or demand the floor. The one who made things easier for everyone else simply by being there. They like to say I was independent. What they meant was that I didn't ask for much. At family gatherings, I was usually the one setting plates down while conversations flowed above me. I listened. I absorbed. If there was tension, I smoothed it. If there was confusion, I clarified it quietly afterward. Over time, this earned me a reputation for being capable, but backgrounded. Someone you could count on, but not someone you needed to consult. No one ever said it outright, but decisions happened around me, not with me. When my parents talked about the future, they spoke in terms of what makes sense and what's practical. They spoke confidently, as if those concepts naturally excluded me from the center of the discussion. I was included in logistics, not in authority. I could execute a plan, but I was never assumed to have authored one. And I accepted that for a long time, not because I believed I lacked intelligence or judgment, but because staying quiet had always kept the peace. I told myself that harmony mattered more than recognition, that being trusted to handle details was a form of respect, that I didn't need to be visible to be valued. There's a subtle difference between being underestimated and being unseen. Underestimation still acknowledges your presence. Invisibility doesn't. My siblings had clearer roles. One was outspoken, emotionally expressive. Another was decisive, even forceful. They took up space without apology. Family narratives bent around them. Their opinions were expected, even when inconvenient. Mine were optional. If I offered an alternative perspective, it was usually met with a nod and a quick redirection. "That's a good point, Daisy," someone would say, before continuing exactly as planned. Over time, I learned that the acknowledgement itself was the end point. No follow-up was coming. What's strange is that no one was cruel. There were no raised voices or harsh words. Everything happened under the language of care, concern, efficiency. They believed they were protecting me from stress, from responsibility, from complexity. They believed I was better off not carrying weight. And because I didn't protest, because I remained calm, they took my composure as confirmation. Calm became evidence. Silence became agreement. Looking back, I can see how the picture formed. I was single. I lived simply. I didn't talk much about my inner life. I didn't dramatize my struggles. To them, that translated into fragility, or perhaps passivity, a woman who coped by minimizing herself. They would say things like, Daisy doesn't like conflict, or she prefers things simple, as if those preferences disqualified me from autonomy. As if complexity was something I couldn't handle, rather than something I navigated every day at work, quietly and competently. I handled contracts, I handled disputes, I handled financial reconciliations for people who were louder, more confident, and far less careful than I was. But my family never saw that version of me. Or maybe they saw it and decided it didn't count, because it didn't disrupt their image of who I was supposed to be. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being useful but not consulted, from being trusted with tasks but not with the truth, from realizing that people believe they know you, when in reality, they've only interacted with the version of you that made their lives smoother. At the time, I didn't frame it as a loss. I framed it as my role. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was above ego. Speaking less made me wiser. I believed restraint was strength, and in many ways it is. But restraint without recognition slowly becomes erasure. And the most dangerous part? When people erase you gently, you don't notice it happening. The first moment I remember wasn't dramatic. That's what made it dangerous. It happened during a conversation that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. We were sitting at my parents' dining table, the kind of evening that blends into memory because nothing appears to go wrong. Paperwork was spread out, property documents, tax statements, notes scribbled in familiar handwriting. I was there because I was good with these things, because they trusted me to look things over. At least that's what I thought. As the discussion moved forward, I noticed something subtle. Decisions were being referenced as if they had already been made. Not proposed, not debated, just stated. Phrases like, when we do this, and the plan is, floated through the room, already settled. I waited for a pause. I didn't interrupt. When I finally spoke, it was careful and specific. I pointed out a clause that could cause issues later. I suggested a different sequence, one that protected everyone involved, including them. There was a silence, not the thoughtful kind, the kind where people exchange looks. Then my older sibling smiled, softly, almost sympathetically, and said, "You're overthinking it, Daisy." Overthinking. The word landed lightly, but it stayed. My mother followed with, "We don't want you stressing yourself out over these things." No one addressed the actual point I'd made. The conversation moved on without resistance, and I sat there nodding, telling myself it wasn't worth pushing. That maybe they were right. That maybe my instinct to analyze was just anxiety dressed up as competence. That's how the first cut works. It doesn't bleed. It just teaches you something. In that moment, I learned that my caution could be reframed as instability, that my attention to detail could be interpreted as emotional excess. And that was when those interpretations came from people who loved me. I was more likely to accept them without question. After that, similar moments followed, small, almost forgettable. A suggestion dismissed as too much. A concern waved away with, "Let's not get Daisy worked up." Laughter, warmth, reassurance. I began to notice a pattern. When I spoke up, the room subtly shifted into management mode. Not collaboration, management. As if my input wasn't a contribution but a condition to be handled gently. And everyone else ignored it. Or maybe they didn't see it as a problem. I didn't confront it. I didn't argue. I told myself I was being sensitive. Family dynamics are complicated. That love isn't always precise. But I remembered. I remembered the way my words changed shape once they left my mouth. How they returned to me softened, diluted, reframed. I remembered the look of relief on their faces when I fell quiet again. Silence restored order. What I didn't realize then was that this was the moment my credibility began to erode. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because a story was being quietly rewritten around me. A story where my competence came with an asterisk, where my judgment was valid only until it complicated things. And once that story exists, people don't need evidence to support it. They only need consistency. I became careful in a new way, not just thoughtful, but cautious about how my thoughts would be received. I edited myself before speaking. I softened my language further. I offered fewer suggestions. They took that as confirmation. That's the cruel efficiency of it. When you respond to being minimized by shrinking, people believe they were right to minimize you in the first place. I didn't know it yet, but that small cut, the one everyone else forgot, was the first mark in a record that would later be used against me. And I was the only one who noticed it being written. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives disguised as routine. After that first moment at the table, nothing changed outwardly. No arguments, no apologies. Life continued with its familiar rhythm: phone calls, updates, shared responsibilities. But underneath it, something had shifted, and I adjusted myself around it without realizing the cost. I started anticipating dismissal before it happened. When I was invited into conversations, I came prepared, but lighter, fewer details, softer language. I learned to preface my thoughts with disclaimers. I might be wrong, or this is probably nothing. I told myself this was emotional intelligence, flexibility, maturity. What it really was self-erasure in polite packaging. The pattern repeated often enough that it became invisible. A suggestion ignored, a concern redirected. A decision was explained to me after it was finalized, as if I were catching up rather than participating. No one raised their voice. No one cut me off mid-sentence. That would have been easier to name. Instead, I was thanked for understanding. They would say things like, "You're so easy to work with," or "We don't have to worry about you." It sounded like praise, and I absorbed it as such. I wanted to believe that being low friction made me valuable. But ease, I learned, is often rewarded with exclusion. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when a line was crossed just enough for me to feel it in my body, a tightening in my chest, a pause that lingered too long, but every time I found a reason not to. It's not worth making it awkward. They mean well. This isn't the hill to die on. I told myself that family required patience, that love meant letting small things go. And slowly, the small things added up. What made it harder was how reasonable they sounded. When they spoke about plans, they framed them as practical necessities. When they adjusted roles, they did it for efficiency. When they made choices that affected me, they reassured me it was temporary, or just until things settle. I didn't challenge those narratives, partly because I had been taught not to trust my discomfort. If something felt off, I assumed the problem was my sensitivity, not their behavior. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through repetition without consequence. I noticed how my siblings were treated differently. Their objections were met with debate. Their resistance was expected, even respected. If they pushed back, it was seen as engagement. When I did, it was a concern, or stress, or confusion. So I stopped pushing. I became the person who agreed quickly, the one who adapted, the one who didn't complicate things. And in doing so, I unintentionally strengthened the story they were telling about me, that I preferred not to be involved in decisions, that responsibility overwhelmed me, that I was better suited to support than to lead. The worst part is that I helped them believe it. Every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace, I reinforced the idea that I didn't have a stake. Every time I downplayed my own insight, I made it easier for others to do the same. I thought I was choosing harmony. What I was actually choosing was invisibility. And invisibility has consequences. Because when people stop seeing you as an equal participant, they start making decisions for you without checking. They stop imagining your resistance. They stop anticipating your consent. They assume it. By the time I noticed how far this had gone, the dynamic felt fixed, normal, as if it had always been this way. That's the danger of normalization. It doesn't feel like harm while it's happening. It feels like routine, like family, like something you adapt to without questioning. Until one day you realize the ground beneath you has shifted, and no one thinks to ask if you're still standing. I didn't wake up one day and realize I had a role. It revealed itself slowly, in the way people spoke about me when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I was the stable one, the one who doesn't need much, The one who's fine either way. Those phrases followed me like a quiet label, one that felt complimentary on the surface, but limiting underneath. Stability in their minds meant I didn't require agency. Flexibility meant I wouldn't resist. Being fine meant I didn't need to be consulted. My role was not to decide, it was to accommodate. When responsibilities were divided, mine were always the same kind: follow through, administration, and emotional buffering. I was the person people handed things to after they were messy. I cleaned them up quietly and returned them solved. And because I did it well, the role solidified. No one asked whether I wanted more visibility, or authority, or ownership. Those questions weren't part of the script. The script assumed I was most comfortable in the background, smoothing the edges of other people's choices. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when my father said, "Daisy doesn't like being in charge." It was said casually, without malice, during a conversation about future planning. I remember feeling a strange disorientation. Not anger, not hurt, just surprise. I'd never said that. I was in charge at work. I made decisions that affected businesses, livelihoods, and contracts worth more than most of what my family ever discussed. But none of that seemed to register. Or perhaps it didn't fit the version of me that felt familiar to them. So they edited it out. The role I was assigned was safe, predictable. It made their lives easier. And because I didn't challenge it openly, it felt justified. Roles harden fastest when the person inside them remains quiet. I noticed how they spoke for me in conversations with others. Daisy wouldn't want that. That might be too much for Daisy. Always said with certainty, always without checking. At first, I corrected them gently. Actually, I'm fine with that. Or, I hadn't thought about it that way. But those corrections were treated as exceptions, not evidence, temporary deviations from an established norm. Eventually, I stopped correcting. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from constantly reintroducing yourself to people who believe they already know you, from having to justify your own capacity in rooms where it's quietly assumed you don't have it. So I let the role stand. I told myself it was easier this way, that not everyone needs to be the decision maker, that support roles matter too, and they do, but only when they're chosen, not imposed. The role I was given didn't come with power, but it came with responsibility. A responsibility to adapt, to absorb, to remain agreeable. And the more I fulfilled it, the more it became the only version of me they recognized. What I didn't realize then was that roles, once assigned, become lenses. Every action you take is interpreted through them. Every emotion is filtered, every objection is reframed. So when I hesitated, it wasn't caution, it was overwhelm. When I questioned, it wasn't insight, it was anxiety. When I went quiet, it wasn't a strategy, it was incapacity. And once people believe that, they don't wait for you to fail. They preemptively protect you. They step in, they take over, they decide, all while telling themselves they're being kind. By the time I understood the full weight of the role I had been assigned, it was already being used to justify decisions that no longer included me at all. And I was still telling myself this was normal, that this was family, that this was love. The day something shifted didn't come with an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic exit from a room. It came in a moment so quiet that I almost missed it. I was alone in my apartment, sorting through documents from work, contracts, correspondence, notes I had made for a client who trusted me enough to hand over a complicated situation without hesitation. I remember noticing how calm I felt while doing it, how focused, how clear my thinking was. I was resolving problems that required judgment, foresight, and decisiveness. And then, almost involuntarily, another thought followed. Why does no one at home see this version of me? The question wasn't angry. It wasn't even sad. It was curious. That was new. Until then, my discomfort had always been emotional: hurt, confusion, a vague sense of being misunderstood. But this was different. This was cognitive, observational, as if I had stepped half a pace outside myself and was watching the pattern instead of living inside it. I started replaying past interactions, not to relive them, but to examine them. The phrases, the timing, who spoke, who decided, who summarized at the end. I noticed how often my role was reactive, how rarely it was initiatory. And I noticed something else too. No one had ever actually tested the belief that I couldn't handle more. They had assumed it, repeated it, reinforced it. But there was no moment where I had failed, panicked, or withdrawn from responsibility in the way they seemed to expect. The evidence simply wasn't there. The realization didn't make me want to argue. It made me want to observe. So I stopped correcting. But this time it wasn't out of exhaustion or appeasement. It was deliberate. I wanted to see how far the assumptions went when left uninterrupted. I listened more closely. I noted what was said and what was implied. I paid attention to how often my supposed limitations were cited in my absence. I didn't challenge the narrative. I let it speak freely. And the more space I gave it, the clearer it became. They weren't responding to me. They were responding to an idea of mine that had been constructed slowly, collectively, and without my input. That's when something inside me settled. Not hardened, not closed, just aligned. I understood in a way I hadn't before that defending myself emotionally would change nothing. The story was already written in their minds, and emotional resistance would only be folded into it as further proof. If I wanted change, it wouldn't come from persuasion. It would come from positioning. That night, I took out my leather-bound notebook, the one I'd carried for years without much intention, and I wrote a single sentence on the first blank page. Silence is only weakness when it's unchosen. I didn't know yet what I would do with that insight. I only knew that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer trying to be seen. I was paying attention. And that made all the difference. After that shift, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still spoke calmly. I still listened more than I talked. I still nodded at the right moments and offered help when asked. But internally, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I chose. And choice changes everything. I stopped volunteering explanations. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. I noticed how often I had been preemptively justifying myself, softening ideas before they were even challenged, translating my own thoughts into something more palatable. I let that go. When conversations happened around me, I didn't rush to insert myself. I let people finish. I let assumptions stand, untouched. I wanted to see what happened when I didn't rush in to manage perceptions. What happened was revealing. My family interpreted my quiet as compliance, as relief, as confirmation that they were right to make decisions without looping me in. They became more comfortable speaking for me, not less, more confident in their interpretations. Daisy's fine with it. She wouldn't want the stress. She trusts us. Each sentence was said with such certainty that it almost sounded rehearsed. And I realized something important. They weren't acting against me. They were acting without imagining my resistance at all. That's a powerful position to be in, when no one is watching for your response. I began to document things, casually at first. Dates, conversations. The way certain phrases are repeated is always framed as concern. I didn't do this with an agenda. I did it because clarity had replaced emotion, and clarity wants structure. I noticed how often responsibility shifted toward me without authority following it. How tasks were delegated, but decisions remained centralized. How my reliability was used as justification for excluding me from control. And still, I said nothing. They mistook my restraint for passivity. There was one moment that stands out. A conversation where plans were outlined that directly affected my future, housing, finances, and long-term arrangements. I was present, physically. But no one asked what I wanted. Not once. I could have interrupted. I could have asked questions. I could have reminded them that I was capable, informed, and engaged. Instead, I listened. Not because I agreed, but because I needed to understand how far this went. I needed to see the full architecture of the belief system they had built around me. And I did. They believed they were protecting me from complexity, from risk, from responsibility. They believed I needed guidance more than agency. And the more they believed it, the more they acted on it. Silence, when chosen, creates space. And in that space, people reveal what they truly think of you. What they revealed wasn't malice. It was certain. Certainty that I would not push back. Certainty that I would adapt. Certainty that whatever they decided, I would make peace with it. That certainty was their blind spot. Because while they were growing more comfortable, I was growing more precise. I was learning the language they used, the systems they relied on, the assumptions they never questioned. I wasn't withdrawing. I was positioning myself where no one thought to look. And when people underestimate you consistently, they stop guarding their process. They speak freely. They document carelessly. They assume alignment where none exists. Silence didn't make me smaller. It made me invisible. And invisibility, I would soon learn, is a powerful place to stand. What they never noticed was how much information flows when no one thinks you're a variable. Once I stopped correcting them, once I let their assumptions sit undisturbed, something opened up. Conversations became looser. Plans were discussed more openly in front of me, not because they valued my input, but because they no longer believed I would challenge anything. I became part of the furniture, present, useful, non-threatening. And from that position, I saw everything. I saw how decisions were justified after the fact, how concern was retrofitted to choices that had already been made. I heard the phrases that came up again and again. For her own good, she wouldn't want the pressure. This is simpler. They weren't just opinions, they were mantras, repeated often enough to feel like the truth. I also began to notice inconsistencies. Timelines didn't always match. Explanations shifted depending on who was in the room. Certain details were emphasized in some conversations and omitted in others. Nothing illegal, nothing explosive, just sloppy. That's what happens when people believe they're unchallenged. Precision erodes. I didn't confront those inconsistencies. I recorded them, quietly, methodically. Not as ammunition, but as data. Dates, phrasing, who said what, and when. I treated it the same way I treated my work, neutral, factual, unemotional. At the same time, I educated myself further, not in a dramatic overnight way, but steadily. I refreshed my understanding of property law, of financial authority, of how capacity is evaluated and who gets to define it. I read court opinions the way some people read novels, slowly, attentively, noticing patterns. What surprised me most was how procedural everything was. So much of what people fear, loss of control, loss of rights, doesn't happen through a single malicious act. It happens through forms, through filings, through narratives that go unchallenged because they sound reasonable. And my family's narrative sounded very reasonable. I was quiet. I was reserved. I didn't assert myself. I let others take the lead. All of that was true. What wasn't true was the conclusion they were drawing from it. But conclusions, once written down, have weight. They never noticed how often I asked clarifying questions that seemed harmless, how I asked for copies just to stay organized, how I followed up conversations with polite summary emails, confirming details in neutral language. They saw cooperation. I saw documentation. They never noticed how I stopped sharing my inner life altogether. Not because I was shutting down, but because I understood something important. Vulnerability, in the wrong context, becomes evidence. So I kept my emotional world private, stable, consistent, unremarkable. And the more unremarkable I appeared, the more freely they spoke. There's a moment in any process where preparation stops feeling like reaction and starts feeling like authorship. I crossed that line without fanfare. No announcement, no internal celebration, just clarity. I understood that if things continued on this path, something irreversible would eventually be attempted. Not out of cruelty, but out of conviction. They genuinely believed they were better equipped to decide for me. And because they believed that, they were leaving a trail. They never noticed that I was following it. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time I understood what I was looking at, the emotional work had already been done. I wasn't scared, I wasn't angry, I wasn't even surprised. I felt something quieter and more durable than any of those. Certainty. The first realization came late one evening, after a phone call that ended the way many of them did. Warm, reassuring, and strangely hollow. I had been thanked again for being understanding, for being low pressure, for trusting everyone else to handle the complicated parts. I set my phone down and opened my notebook. I began laying things side by side. Not opinions, facts, dates, statements, documents, emails that followed conversations, language that repeated almost word for word across different people in different times. And there it was, a narrative, not spoken outright, not formalized yet, but clearly forming, a story about me that framed my quiet nature not as temperament, but as limitation. My emotional restraint is not as regulation, but as fragility. My independence is not as competence, but as isolation. It was subtle, and because it was subtle, it was dangerous. I noticed how often the word capacity appeared, not directly, but implied. She gets overwhelmed. She prefers simplicity. She wouldn't manage well under pressure. Each statement alone was harmless. Together, they pointed somewhere specific. I recognized the shape because I had seen it before. In case law, in professional disputes, in documents where someone's voice slowly disappears under the guise of protection. This wasn't about one decision. It was about authority. That night, I began a deeper review, not of my family, but of the systems they were beginning to touch. I read statutes. I read the evaluation standards. I read how concern becomes recommendation, and how recommendation becomes restriction when no one objects early enough. What struck me most was how little proof was actually required when no counter-narrative exists. Silence doesn't just allow assumptions, it finalizes them. The private reveal wasn't that something bad had happened. It was that something irreversible could, and that all the preconditions were quietly being met. And then I saw it. In one innocuous email, a line so casual it almost escaped notice, a suggestion that it might be helpful to get an outside perspective, just to make sure everything is handled appropriately. Outside perspective, neutral words, clean words. But I knew what they meant. An evaluator doesn't arrive out of nowhere. They arrive at the end of a chain, after concern has been normalized, after roles have been solidified, after the subject has been sufficiently minimized. And I had been minimized thoroughly. The clarity that followed was cold, but not cruel. I understood something fundamental. No one in my family believed they were acting against me. That made them more dangerous than if they hadn't. Because people who believe they are helping don't question their authority. I didn't confront anyone, I didn't warn them, I didn't shift my behavior. I stayed exactly as I had been, quiet, cooperative, composed. But internally, everything reorganized. I stopped thinking emotionally and started thinking structurally. What mattered now was not how I felt, but what could be proven. Not what I intended, but what could be inferred. Not who loved me, but who would be believed. I reviewed my own history with the same detachment. Employment records, financial independence, decision-making authority, and professional contexts. Third-party validations that existed independently of my family's perspective. I saw clearly that my life told one story, and their narrative told another. That divergence was leverage. The private reveal wasn't a triumph. It wasn't satisfactory. It was a responsibility. Because once you see the machinery, you can't pretend you don't understand it anymore. I also realized something humbling. If I reacted emotionally, if I protested loudly, if I accused, if I demanded reassurance, it would accelerate everything. It would confirm the story they were already telling. So I didn't. Instead, I asked neutral questions. I requested information under the guise of organization. I continued documenting without signaling urgency. I let them believe they were ahead of me. The truth was, they had already shown their hand. And the most important part of the reveal? I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need to confront anyone. I didn't need to win an argument. I simply needed to stop being the silent subject of someone else's concern and become the quiet author of my own record. That understanding settled into me with unexpected calm. No adrenaline, no fear, no rush, just clarity. From that moment on, every step I took was measured. Every silence is intentional. Every cooperation is strategic. They believed the story was already written. They didn't realize I had begun editing the footnotes. There comes a moment when awareness demands action. Not impulsive action, not emotional reaction, but commitment. A line where doing nothing is no longer neutral, where stillness becomes a decision in itself. That was where I found myself. I didn't rush toward it. I approached it the same way I approached everything else by then, slowly, deliberately, without theatrics. I laid out the options in my mind the way I would for a client. I could confront them. That option was loud, immediate, satisfying on the surface. I imagined the conversation, my voice steady but firm, laying out everything I had noticed, demanding recognition. I knew how it would end, with reassurances, with hurt expressions, with phrases like, "You're misunderstanding us," and "We're only worried about you." And afterward, nothing would truly change, except that I would now be seen as emotional, defensive, possibly unstable. I could withdraw, create distance, reduce contact, protect myself by stepping away entirely. That option promised peace, but it came with risk. Silence without structure invites interpretation. Absence can be framed as avoidance. Withdrawal could be documented as disengagement. That left the third option, irreversibility. Not in the dramatic sense, Not in a scorched earth way, but in the only way that mattered, establishing facts that could not be rewritten by concern, softened by interpretation, or overridden by someone else's confidence. I understood then that this was not a family problem. It was a procedural one. The system doesn't respond to intentions, it responds to records, and records favor the prepared. Choosing that path meant accepting something difficult. I would not be understood in the moment. I would not be thanked. There would be no emotional closure at the start, only later, and possibly never in the way people imagine it. But it would be final. I spent days, not in anxiety, but in alignment, asking myself one question over and over. Can I live with the consequences of this choice, even if no one ever acknowledges why I made it? The answer surprised me with its calmness. Yes, because what I was protecting wasn't pride. It wasn't an image. It wasn't even the relationship as it currently existed. It was an agency. I decided that from that point forward, I would only act in ways that required no explanation later. That stood on its own, that did not depend on tone, memory or interpretation. No speeches, no warnings, no emotional signals. Just movement. Once that decision was made, something lifted. The constant internal negotiation ended. I no longer weighed how things might be perceived emotionally. I focused on how they would stand, procedurally. The irony is that to everyone else, I probably seemed more relaxed than ever. I didn't push back, I didn't argue. I didn't appear distressed. They took my composure as comfort. They didn't realize that the choice had already been made, and that everything after that point was simply execution. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down, in a good way. Urgency disappeared. I wasn't racing anyone. I wasn't reacting to threats. I was simply placing pieces where they needed to go, one at a time, without drawing attention to the pattern they formed. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing only what doesn't need explanation. I started with structure. I separated what had always been loosely grouped: my finances, my documents, my authority. Not dramatically, not defensively. I treated it like routine maintenance. Accounts clarified, access boundaries formalized, records updated so they spoke clearly on their own without interpretation. Every step was ordinary. That was the point. I made sure my professional life was visibly stable in ways that didn't require me to speak about it. Consistent income, independent obligations, third-party references that existed outside of family narratives. The kind of stability that doesn't argue. It just exists. At the same time, I continued playing my assigned role perfectly. I was agreeable, helpful, calm. I didn't withdraw or assert myself suddenly. I didn't correct assumptions. I let concern flow past me without resistance. Concern, when unchallenged, grows bolder. I noticed how freely they began discussing next steps, how certain they sounded. How often did they speak in terms of inevitability rather than possibility? No one noticed that I had stopped sharing anything new. There were moments when they tried to check in, casual questions framed as care. How are you feeling about everything? I answered honestly, but selectively. I'm fine. I'm managing. Things feel steady. All true, none revealing. The legal and administrative steps I took were unremarkable individually. Forms, appointments, verifications, the kind of things people postpone because they feel tedious or unnecessary, until they suddenly matter. I made them matter quietly. I ensured that my capacity, competence, and autonomy were reflected in places that didn't require advocacy, places where tone doesn't exist, where words mean only what they say. And then I waited. Waiting is part of silence. Not passive waiting, observant waiting. Watching how people behave when they believe the outcome is already secured. They became less careful, more confident. I heard more phrases that assumed resolution, that spoke of future arrangements as if they were already settled. They never asked me to sign anything. They didn't think they needed to. What they didn't know was that every assumption they made reduced their margin for reinterpretation later. Every step they skipped, every detail they waved away, was being quietly outpaced by something solid and verifiable. Silence protected me from being pulled into premature conversations. It kept me from revealing my position before it was stable. By the time movement replaced speculation, the groundwork was already in place. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They never do when people are certain of their control. At first, it showed up as confusion, a conversation that didn't land the way it was expected to, a pause where agreement usually followed. I noticed it in the way plans were referenced more cautiously, with less confidence than before. Something wasn't moving the way they thought it would. They didn't blame me. Not yet. The first instinct was to blame the system. Delays. Technicalities. These things always take longer than you expect, someone said lightly, waving it off. I nodded, calm, neutral. But the tone had changed. The certainty was thinning. I saw it in the follow-up calls. More frequent, more probing. Questions framed as casual curiosity that carried a subtle edge underneath. Just checking, they'd say. We want to make sure everything's aligned. Aligned with what? They never said. They began to feel a loss before they understood its source. Authority, when assumed rather than secured, is fragile. The moment it encounters friction, it reveals itself as expectation rather than fact. I watched as they tried to reassert momentum. Conversations became more directive. Suggestions were framed as reminders. Remember, the plan was, we already agreed that. I didn't contradict them. I simply didn't move. That was the first real consequence. Motion stopped working. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to create unease. I could sense the discomfort growing, not panic yet, but irritation. The kind that comes from realizing that cooperation is no longer automatic, that the room no longer bends the way it used to. They started speaking about me differently when I was present. Less confidently, more carefully, as if testing a new tone without acknowledging why the old one no longer fit. What unsettled them most was that I hadn't changed emotionally. I wasn't upset. I wasn't withdrawn. I wasn't defensive. I was simply unavailable in the way they were used to. Concern depends on access. Once access changes, concern loses its footing. There was a moment, a small one, when I realized they were beginning to feel something they had never associated with me before. Uncertainty. They didn't yet understand that something had shifted beneath their assumptions. They only knew that the familiar pattern wasn't producing the same results. And patterns, when broken quietly, are deeply unsettling. They started talking more among themselves. I could hear it in the summaries they gave me afterward. The way decisions were now described with qualifiers instead of confidence. Nothing had exploded, but nothing was working the way it used to. And that was enough to change the air in the room. The shift from unease to panic is not loud. It's inefficient. Things stop lining up. Conversations circle instead of advancing. People repeat themselves, hoping repetition will restore authority. That's when I knew they were trying to fix something they didn't yet understand that had already moved past repair. They began reaching out more deliberately. Not urgently. Urgency would have revealed too much, but insistently. Messages framed as updates that contained questions, invitations to touch base, a sudden interest in my schedule, my availability, my thoughts. I responded the way I always had, politely, calmly, without friction. But the old ease was gone. They wanted reassurance, and I offered none, only consistency. I answered what was asked, nothing more, nothing less. I didn't volunteer opinions, I didn't anticipate needs, I didn't step in to smooth discomfort. That absence of emotional labor was disorienting for them. They began to contradict themselves. Plans that had once been described as settled were now just ideas. Decisions that had been framed as inevitable were suddenly open to discussion. The language softened, not out of humility, but out of necessity. They were recalibrating. I could see them trying to reinsert themselves into a position of control, asking questions they should have asked earlier, requesting clarification they no longer had the authority to demand. But the window for informal correction had closed. Systems don't respond to tone shifts. By the time they realized something formal had changed, it was too late to reverse it quietly. That was the moment panic surfaced. Not emotional panic, but strategic panic. The kind that shows up as hurried consultations, fragmented explanations, and a growing need to get on the same page. They tried to initiate a family meeting. I agreed. An agreement costs nothing when the outcome is already determined. The meeting was calm. Too calm. Everyone spoke carefully, as if the right phrasing might undo whatever friction they were feeling. They emphasized unity, intentions, care. They revisited old narratives, trying to anchor them again. I listened. At one point, someone said, "We just want to make sure you're okay with how things are unfolding." The question came too late. Because what they were really asking was whether I would re-enter the role they had assigned me. Quiet, adaptable, accommodating. And I didn't. Not with confrontation, not with refusal. I simply said, I'm comfortable with where things are. True, precise, unusable. That was when the confusion turned into something closer to fear. They realized they no longer had leverage through reassurance, or through concern, or through familiarity. The informal channels they relied on were no longer effective, and the formal ones no longer favored them. They had assumed time was on their side. It wasn't. The system doesn't wait for emotional readiness. It recognizes only what's been established. By the end of that meeting, nothing had been resolved, but everything had been exposed. They could feel it. The loss of traction, the inability to steer the outcome without acknowledging facts they didn't want to face. They tried afterward to soften things, individual conversations, gentle appeals, reminders of history, of closeness. But the structure had already been set, and structures don't bend to nostalgia. What they wanted now was reassurance. What they needed earlier was consent, and that moment had passed. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like one. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic reveals. It happened in the quietest way possible, through acknowledgement rather than argument. We sat together in a neutral space. No one had chosen it for symbolism, but it worked that way anyway. Not a family home, not my apartment. Somewhere without history clinging to the walls. They spoke first, carefully, measured, words chosen with intention now. They asked questions they should have asked long ago, about my plans, my understanding, my comfort level. Each question circled the same unspoken realization. I was no longer where they thought I was. I answered calmly, not defensively, not generously, just accurately. I didn't explain my process. I didn't narrate my internal journey. I didn't point out patterns or list grievances. I knew better than to turn clarity into a performance. At one point, someone said, "We were only trying to help." I believed them, so I didn't argue with that either. I said, "I know." That was it. No elaboration, no qualification, no counterclaim. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was recalibrating. They were waiting for something else. For reassurance, perhaps. For anger they could respond to. For emotion they could manage. I offered none. Instead, I named one fact. Not as a challenge, as information. I'm capable of making my own decisions, and I've made them. Not louder than the room, not softer either. Just stated. What struck me in that moment was how disarming calm certainty can be. There was nothing to push against, no tone to correct, no feeling to soothe, only reality. They tried briefly to revisit intention, to reframe concern as love, to soften the edges with familiarity. I let them speak. And then I said something I had never said before. Not because I hadn't felt it, but because it hadn't been necessary until then. I don't need to be protected from my own life. The words landed without force. No one interrupted. No one argued. Because there was nothing in them that could be dismissed as emotion. That was the moment the role dissolved. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. The version of me they had been speaking to no longer existed in the room. They could feel it. And for the first time, they had to adjust. Not to manage me, but to recognize me. The confrontation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. There were no apologies, no declarations, no tidy ending. But something fundamental had shifted. They no longer spoke for me. And I no longer needed them to understand why. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. It's not a hardened version of who I was, or a sharper one, or a louder one. It's a clearer one. I didn't emerge from this angry. I didn't become suspicious of everyone, or allergic to closeness, or obsessed with control. What changed wasn't my temperament, it was my orientation. I no longer wait to be interpreted correctly. Before, I believed that if I stayed calm enough, reasonable enough, patient enough, people would eventually see me as I was. That clarity would arrive if I earned it through consistency. Now I understand something quieter and more useful. Clarity doesn't arrive. It's established. I still value restraint. I still listen carefully. I still choose my words. But I no longer confuse emotional regulation with self-erasure. Silence is no longer my default. It's a tool I use intentionally. I speak earlier now, not louder, earlier. I no longer allow narratives to form around me without my participation. Not by correcting every assumption, but by placing facts where they belong, clearly, early, and without apology. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was once the dynamic shifted. People often imagine that reclaiming agency requires confrontation, but in my experience, it requires alignment. Once my actions, boundaries, and records aligned, there was nothing left to argue about. Even within my family, the change settled slowly, but permanently. They didn't suddenly understand everything. They didn't fully grasp the internal cost of what had happened. But they adjusted their behavior. They asked instead of assuming. They paused instead of deciding. Not because they were forced to, because the old version of me was no longer available to carry their certainty. I no longer measure closeness by how much I accommodate. I measure it by how much agency is respected. There's a calm that comes with that, a steadiness that doesn't need validation. I still live quietly. I still prefer simplicity. But now those things are expressions of preference, not evidence used against me. And perhaps most importantly, I trust myself in a way I didn't before. Not because I proved anything to anyone else, but because I proved something to myself. That I can move deliberately, protect my autonomy, and remain humane at the same time. I didn't have to become someone else. I just had to stop disappearing. There is a temptation at the end of stories like this to offer a warning, to say, be careful, or watch out, or never trust anyone completely. But that's not the truth I arrived at. The truth is quieter. Most harm doesn't come from malice. It comes from certainty. Certainty that someone else knows better. Certainty that concern equals authority. Certainty that silence means consent. When those certainties go unchallenged, they harden into structures that are very difficult to undo. What happened to me didn't begin with cruelty. It began with love filtered through assumption, with roles assigned too early and never revisited, with a version of me that was convenient and therefore never questioned. And I allowed that version to stand for too long. That doesn't mean I blame myself, but it does mean I understand my responsibility differently now. Not to explain myself endlessly, not to manage other people's comfort, but to participate in the narratives that shape my life before they solidify without me. Quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about authorship. It's about understanding that systems respond to what is established, not what is felt. That agency is protected not by volume, but by clarity. And that you don't need to expose anyone's wrongdoing to step out of a role that no longer serves you. You just need to stop performing it. If there's one moral I carry forward, it's this. You can be gentle without being invisible. You can be calm without being overruled. And you can love people without surrendering your right to decide your own life. I don't share this story to make anyone distrust their family. I share it for the people who recognize themselves in the quiet spaces between these moments, the ones who are trusted to cope, to adapt, to be fine, while their voice slowly fades from the room. If that's you, know this. Nothing is wrong with your temperament. Your restraint is not a flaw. Your silence is not a weakness, unless it's being mistaken for agreement. So I'll end with a question, not as advice, but as an invitation to reflect and to share if you feel comfortable. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that someone else was quietly deciding your future because they believed you wouldn't object?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.